Good morning, everybody. I'm Tim O'Brien. I'm the senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion, the commentary arm of Bloomberg News. And this is our weekly politics live stream. Our topic today is anti-Americanism in the age of Donald Trump and during Donald Trump's second tour of the White House. And I'm joined today by two smarties and friends and colleagues on Bloomberg Opinion. Karishma Vaswani, who covers politics and policy for us across the Asia-Pacific region. She's based in Singapore. And Adrian Wooldridge, who is based in London and covers global business and global politics with obviously a special focus on Europe. I'm going to start with you today, Adrian, and I'm going to embarrass you a little bit. I want to read from a column you just wrote about anti-Americanism, and the writing in it is typically superb and pungent and useful, I think, as a departure point for us to talk about what's at stake for the United States as Donald Trump sprints across diplomatic minefields and economic minefields that presidents once feared to tread. Here's what you wrote, Adrian. Canadians have taken to booing the American national anthem and Panamanians to burning U.S. flags. The British tabloids have tarred and feathered Vice President J.D. Vance for insulting British troops. A carnival float in Dusseldorf, Germany, displayed giant puppets of Donald Trump and his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, shaking hands while squeezing Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky between them into a bloodied pulp. A sign on the float read, Hitler-Stalin Pact 2.0. Back at home, the Washington Post has published a guide on how to navigate hostility abroad. Dress neutrally, not politically. There has never been a better time to be anti-American. So as the lone American on the live stream right now, Adrian, unpack that for me. And I guess tell me what inspired you to take that column up. And as a longtime observer of dynamics like this, what feels new to you?
Yes, I mean, it just struck me that anti-Americanism is always a potentially big force in the world. And most hegemonic powers, of which America is the leading one in the world, usually take steps to calm anti-American or anti-them sentiments in the world. They tend to invest in soft power. They tend to carry a big stick, but tend not to use this in an aggressive way. And Trump is reversing all of those things. And if you're the hegemonic power in the world and you say America first, people are very nervous about that. If you're a massive economy and you say we're going to put up tariffs wherever we want to in order to encourage people to be more subordinate to us, then people will react against that. So it suddenly struck me that this is a big force in the world. It's not just a rhetorical problem. It's a problem for America's alliances, that people will gang up against it. It's a problem for America's policies. And it's also, strangely enough, it's a problem for populism. Trump is the leader of this global movement of populists, but instead of encouraging other populists around the world, he's actually squeezing them. We've seen the Liberal Party reviving in Canada, and we've seen Trump's best friend Nigel Farage enormously embarrassed by Trump's attitude towards Zelensky, and his support is going down. So it's counterproductive in terms of alliances. It's counterproductive in terms of political power. It's a problem.
Well, I'm going to channel Donald Trump for a minute here, Adrian, and say, so what? You sound like a whiner to me, because the U.S. has been taken advantage of in the Trumpian worldview. It's paid into the defense of Europe without getting anything back. It's been a piñata for trade deals that take advantage of U.S. wealth without returning the economic favors in the other direction. It's long overdue that the United States put its foot down and stop putting up with this crud. So, and why is an Englishman, of all people, complaining about this, given the fact that the UK has paraded across the globe for centuries doing exactly the same thing?
There is a certain amount of truth in that. a certain amount of truth in that. I think the European powers have been irresponsible. They haven't spent enough on their own defense. They've relied on America to defend them. That's certainly true. And they've also made lots of noises about increasing their defense expenditure and failed to do so. And now, because of Trump, they are finally getting their act together, particularly Germany. So that is true. But nevertheless, a global system of alliances is in America's interests. It may have paid a bit more for that system of alliances than it needed to. It may have been too much the sole bearer of military costs, but nevertheless, that system of alliances is something that it's a big global investment. America has been investing in that system for 45 years. America is the biggest global economy, is the net beneficiary of that system of alliances, and trashing it in the way that America is doing is costing it far more than America has ever invested in military spending. And some of this is weird. The stuff about Greenland, for example. When Trump says,
lots of this is weird, Adrian, not some of this. Lots of this is weird.
Most of it is weird. But he's saying we need to defend Greenland. We need to take over Greenland in order to defend it. American troops are there. It's part of the NATO alliance. It's part of the American global sort of power system. It's already happening. So what worries me is that a global system that overwhelmingly benefits the United States is being weakened at exactly the time when the axis of autocracy is strengthening its internal alliances. China and Russia are more closely aligned than they ever have been before. Lots of other countries, including Iran and North Korea, are closer to those countries than they have been before. So Trump is unraveling at a time when the enemies of global liberalism are raveling, if that's a word.
Karishma, Adrian gave us a nice departure point to talk for a second, both about, obviously, APAC is a mammoth region, so it is not one thing, and China looms large across the entire region. But this idea that Adrian introduced, that the U.S. does extract, which I agree with, benefits from global alliances and from spending on both those relationships and a military presence overseas, because it ensures global stability, and the United States gets massive economic benefits from that. You wrote a very compelling column about what Trump's saber rattling and he's getting to the point actually of saber drawing means for the relationship with China. And I'm just going to read from you two, since I'll embarrass both of you this morning. But these are great changes unseen in a century, as the Chinese saying goes. The phrase, which was first used by President Xi Jinping during a speech in 2017 and was born in the aftermath of the Great Recession, is particularly apt today. It reflects his narrative that the U.S. is in decline and it's China's turn to be the global leader. Donald Trump is bringing Xi closer to realizing that ambition with each passing day. The U.S. president's actions point to an isolationist foreign policy and a nation that is no longer a reliable partner. Just a year ago, Karishma, we were talking about whether or not China was the new Japan, and whether or not it had plateaued economically, and the 3-decade triumph of its economic model and its place in the world might be moving into a cul-de-sac. You're pointing out now that what Trump is doing is actually revivifying all of those possibilities for China.
I think there's two separate things happening here. I think the economy for China is still problematic, and I think that those problems aren't going to disappear overnight. There's a consumption issue there, and that is something that you consistently hear from Xi Jinping and the officials who are running the economy that they know they need to address. But what I think they're seeing right now, and you hear these sentiments being expressed in speeches as well at the National People's Congress last week during the press conference that the foreign minister held, Wang Yi. He talked again about how China is trying to be this responsible player that plays by the rules. And, you know, we have to point out that those rules are often interpreted precisely the way that Beijing wants them to be interpreted. But this is becoming a really easy marketing game for the Chinese, thanks to Donald Trump. You know, every single day in headlines across Asia, and I just have to take Singapore as an example where I'm based, there are you know, statements coming out from Donald Trump that today there's going to be tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And then, you know what, tomorrow, maybe there won't be. And there's a degree of unpredictable chaos that is really rattling not just the stock markets, but also, as Adrian pointed out, the relationships that have been built for decades. And, you know, just carrying on from what Adrian said, it's one thing to talk about how this multilateral system of trade and security that have gone hand in hand for years and that have kept the region, particularly the Asia Pacific region, safer, but also richer, not just in terms for the US, but the other thing to remember, and a lot of people, you know, do remember this out here, is the United States helped to create the architecture of that system in the post-World War II era. And now it's literally taking that textbook and ripping it up in front of everybody to see. So, you know, the United States is still such a hugely important economic, cultural, security partner for people and governments out here in Asia. And I think there's a real degree of bewilderment. And they've been through Trump 1.0 before. They've been through the first Trump administration. But this feels quite something different. And
in what way, Karishma? What are they bewildered by?
I think they're bewildered by the pace at which things are changing, and also the tone and tenor of the discussions that are taking place in Washington, where it's literally, you know, it's not just America first. And I know this has been used a lot, but it is also, it really feels like it's America alone, or it's, you know, our way, or you're not even part of this discussion. It's our way and you're out. And it does feel like the Trump administration, and when it comes to foreign policy, is quite content to sort of carve out different spheres of influence and look after the Western Hemisphere, talk about Greenland as if it's going to go out there and just take it over, you know, Canada being the 51st state. These are discussions that imperialists have. And, you know, to your point the question that you asked, Adrian, earlier, that what's the difference? The UK did the same thing. That was a different era. We are no longer in that era. You know, United States.
Although I would point out that I think he himself believes he's in that era. I think he thinks about the world. He's like a 16th century mercantilist. He thinks in trading blocks, not trading partners. And as you just mentioned, he thinks about spheres of influence, not global alliances. And he's retrogressive in that regard. And it's a simplistic view of the world, but I think it's one he deeply holds.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that and finish at this point, the reason why that's problematic for people across the Asia Pacific region, and it is a huge swathe of people that I'm talking about, but they don't want to have to make the choice that China leads the way. They don't want to make that choice. The United States has been a beacon of democracy, modernity, innovation. It's really sort of shown the way forward for so many countries out here. And now they feel like they simply they don't have many options in front of them.
I want to remind our audience that our wonderful producer, Mary Newman, can pluck your questions out of the ether and put them in front of me and my colleagues, and we will do our best to try to answer them if they're good questions. Karishma, I just want to stay on you for one more second and sort of put the same question in front of you that I did in front of Adrian. Isn't this just a bunch of whining from APAC? After all, China's been pickpocketing intellectual property from the United States for years. China's been flouting the World Trade Organization norms to its own benefit, doing end runs around trade agreements. Isn't it time that Trump just has a great big economic flex and puts China permanently in its place? And when he does, won't that ultimately be good for the rest of the region as well? So why are people so angry about all of this?
Is he doing that? Is the question that I would ask back. What has he done? And, you know, to your point that the Chinese have stolen intellectual property and flouted many of those trading rules or used the system to their advantage, that's absolutely true. And in fact, now more than ever, there is a case to be made for a concerted sort of joined up effort to try and address those issues, not just on the economic side, but in places like the South China Sea, where almost every day there are incursions by the Chinese or aggressive actions against Philippine vessels that are, you know, in their own territory, but the Chinese claim that that entire area is theirs. Isn't it time, particularly now, for the United States to take on a much more powerful global mantle of leadership rather than to retreat, which is what it looks like it's doing?
Adrian, I want to ask you what's new here in terms of the United States stepping on its own feet reputationally and from a policy standpoint. If we look back at, say, World War II to the present, the U.S. was the arsenal of democracy in World War II. American lives and metal were sacrificed in Europe to preserve democracy. That image got smudged during the Vietnam War era. You know, I think people had a gray sensibility at best about what that conflict amounted to. And then the Iraq War entered the landscape as well. And George W. Bush ultimately became very unpopular because of that exercise, that invasion in response to 9/11. And now we have Trump. So over that arc of events, which I've, you know, just sort of squeezed into a kind of a crude summary, how is this different from, say, Iraq or any other moment when a U.S. Exercise of power has diminished people's understanding of what the country is really about?
Yeah, we've seen two big surges in anti-American sentiment that I can think of. One was during the Vietnam War, when we had massive protests, you know, across Europe, and Nixon, in particular, who got the blame for the Vietnam War, in our minds, was a massively vilified figure. And the second was during the George W. Bush administration, when the sort of charts we're seeing now with support for America plummeting were exactly the same. When Bush was and Cheney were widely vilified, and there was a sense of America massively overplaying its hand, acting as an imperialist, throwing its weight around the world. But there was a big difference then, that during the Nixon era, Kennedy era, America was fighting, maybe badly, maybe foolishly, but nevertheless fighting an obvious evil, which was global communism, and was using its power to fight global communism. During the Iraq War, the case that was being made was America needed to use its power to get rid of a terrible dictator in Iraq and to spread democracy in the rest of the world. So it was this sort of idealist notion of America's power being used to benefit the world, either by resisting communism or by resisting Arab dictatorship. Here, there is no pretense about it.
And there's no pretense about the goals, which isn't preserving democracy for the rest of the world, but essentially ensuring Donald Trump's own personal hegemony and the United States' public hegemony in this era. Is that essentially how it's perceived, Adrian? Oh, Adrian froze for a minute. There's a glitch. I thought he just stopped, like right on point. I thought, oh, he's back. He's back. Are you back, Adrian? Can you hear me?
Did I stop? I could see myself, but I couldn't see
you.
And
I didn't do that. There are times when you and I are conversing where I want to just freeze you.
Oh, dang.
It's Ukraine hackers. It must.
What I was trying to say was that if America claims to be acting in the interests of the world, either to control communism or to control Arab dictatorships, then you can say, yes, that's something I get on board with. But if America claims that it's acting in its own interests and that those interests are at variance with the rest of the world, and it's trying to stop itself being ripped off, it wants American prosperity, American greatness. It's who's going to support that? I'm not going to go around. No non-American is going to go around claiming that this is a good way to do it. Now, if you are in the position, as Britain was in the 19th century, of being the global hegemon, you have to justify that on the grounds that you're providing public goods for the world, that you're keeping the sea lanes open, that you're fighting bad people, that you're providing stability to the world. What America is doing is something quite extraordinary, which is to retreat from that role, both rhetorically and practically, at a time when it doesn't need to. The American economy is as powerful as it's ever been. Britain retreated from that role because it had to retreat from that role because its economy was shrinking relative to the rest of the world. America's economy is doing well. It is willingly sacrificing global leadership rhetorically and global leadership practically at a time when it doesn't need to do so. It is self-harm that is inflicting here. It's very, very difficult to grasp from outside. Now, there is a sense in which lots of anti-Americans around the world, or people who like to take pot shots at America, are now having second thoughts, thinking, wait a minute, we want your power, we want your benevolence. But that's true, we do need it. The world system does need that. Europeans have been riding, too freely on America. We now recognize that. But please come back.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Karishma. Jump in.
Just to jump in there, because something that Adrian said reminded me of what the Singapore defense minister said very recently, precisely that, words to that effect. And just to quote from him when he was speaking at the Munich Security Conference, he said that America's primacy has become the overriding consideration in foreign policy, and that Asia's image of the US has changed from liberator to great disruptor to a landlord seeking rent. So this underlines that idea, as Adrian was saying just now, that people don't want this to happen. It's not like they're sort of holding up a flag and say, America, please go home. This has become a sort of really difficult fact for Asian governments to try and deal with. They're trying to figure out what their security posture should be in this situation, whether they also need to go to Washington to pay homage and figure out what that relationship might be. And I wonder what the strategy is. Often when I speak to officials in this part of the world, they're saying to me, we don't know what the US is going to do with China. Is it trying to wash its hands of Ukraine so it can really focus on Beijing? That doesn't seem clear. We'd love to know, but nobody's telling us. And I think that chaos itself can be quite unsettling, because countries can't exist in a vacuum, right? And that's when you have Beijing coming in and saying quite legitimately that, hey, look, and I think you will continue to hear this, Tim, if we continue to see this kind of chaos from the States, I think China will very rightly be able to stand on international stages and say things like, we're playing by the rules, we want a multilateral world, and we want a rules-based order.
And that we've always told you the United States is a haphazard, juvenile, undisciplined country that prioritizes the individual above the community, and the outcome is you have wayward, unpredictable actions. I think can be a caricature, obviously, but it's certainly part of the Chinese worldview of the U.S. model.
And that's where democracy leads, right? Like it's a really great way to say, look, this is what the democratic system can give you. This is the ultimate outcome of this system.
And the thing I think the world is going to have to understand about Trump is, although he's goal-oriented, he's not strategic. And one of his goals is to keep everyone else off balance. He is most comfortable as a leader making people believe he's unpredictable. And he relishes being unpredictable because it keeps everyone else off balance. And that's fine as a campaign strategy. It's fine if you're playing ping pong, or tennis. It's not great when you're trying to form global alliances, but it may be a feature of his leadership over the next 4 years, that there never actually will be clarity, and people are going to have to adjust to that. And I think that, your quote from the Singaporean official, there was something, I think either today or yesterday, the Taiwan defense minister or foreign minister was remarking upon the fact that TSMC is now building plants in the United States to appease Trump, but at the same time, that weakens the Silicon Shield that protects Taiwan from a Chinese invasion. And he said something similar. We are going to have to figure out how to stand for ourselves now if the United States is not going to stand between Taiwan and China for us. Adrian, is this irreversible? The UK has done a good job at different moments of shooting itself in the foot. Germany is struggling right now. France is struggling. Western democracies, both economically and politically, are fractious. The UK engaged in one of the great epic self-owns of recent years, I think, in embracing Brexit. Do big countries that make big economic and political moves like this recover from them?
Yeah, sure, they do. And let's say that, let me try and present the good side of what's happening with Trump. And that is that Europe is finally overcoming its dependency on the United States and its sense of psychological dependency on the United States, and is finally beginning to look after itself. Germany really does look as though now it's going to seriously increase its military spending and is seriously going to start producing some military hardware. The relationship between Britain and the and Europe, which was very damaged by Brexit, is now better than it's ever been. Starmer emerging as a sort of leader, creating a sort of military set of alliances that transcend European bickering. Poland obviously taking the lead in terms of serious military spending, but Europe has got strangely more self-confidence, more notion that it has to take the lead in all of this sort of thing, and more awareness that there's quite a lot of manufacturing power that can be used to defend Europe. So I think that's a sort of, we were much too dependent on the United States. The global sort of defense order was firing on one cylinder. We may get a system in which it's firing on more than one cylinder. And if America, after the Trump administration, becomes more normal, we don't know that, but if it becomes more normal, we have the basis of a much sounder global order, I think.
You're assuming he's going to leave office after this term, Adrian, but that's a subject. That's a subject.
He leaves office, and I'm my view of Trump is that I thought he had the basis of a long-term Reagan-style realignment there. Had he been calmer, had he played his hands more carefully, and that he's
been more like Reagan, which is not.
He's taken a few more naps. He's overreached. He's creating resistance. He's creating resistance in the business and finance community. He's creating resistance across Europe. He's keeping everybody off balance, but he's also keeping everybody so nervous that they're sort of reacting against him. I think that he's one of the interesting things. We all thought that the election of Trump in the United States would ignite a sort of revival of or resurgence of global populism, and because he's been so pro-Russian, so anti-Ukrainian, he's divided populists and he's weakened populists. So his supposed best friend in Britain, the leader of the Reform Party, is being squeezed by this. He's in a weaker position than ever because most Britons don't approve of invading Ukraine.
Karishma, when we talk about Europe's view of the United States, there are shared historical and political and economic traditions there. There's a different kind of connective tissue than when we speak about big parts of the Asia Pacific region in the United States. And again, we're speaking on behalf of hundreds of millions of people, more than billions of people, in fact. Yeah. But what is different in I think in terms of how Asians see this moment compared to Europe? And I'll put the same question in front of you that I just did it in front of Adrian: is, can the U.S. recover from some of the foundational wrecking balls that are being swung right now?
So what I think is really useful to do, and essentially we're doing that, is to think about what Asia or Europe is going to look like in 4 years' time, when the Trump administration comes to its natural end for whatever reason, or even if it doesn't, just that period of time. And what I think will be a defining feature in Asia is that everybody is arming up in some way or another. Defense budgets are going up. My view of that is that it makes for a much more dangerous world. I think it is a natural consequence of feeling like you're trapped between a superpower that has in the past been your security partner and a superpower that is in your backyard and is very, very militarily successful at ramping up its army and its navy. And that's left countries from Japan to India to Singapore to Australia very little choice. And I think that will be the defining consequence in Asia from the Trump administration effectively looking like it's retreating, because there's no more lattice-like network of countries that the US could take on these, Avenger-like freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea. And that nervousness is going to mean more money being spent on defense budgets, perhaps less money being spent in other areas. But I think that will be one of the defining characteristics of this era.
And with that, we've run out of time. I'm going to ask both of you to come back periodically, because I think this is clearly an evergreen topic. We could come back to this multiple times a year for many years to come, fortunately or unfortunately. Fortunately for me, because I get to spend more time with you, Adrienne Wooldridge, our global business and policy columnist in London, and you, Karishma Vaswani, our politics and policy columnist in Singapore. Thank you both for joining us today. I'm Tim O'Brien of Bloomberg Opinion, and we will see you again next week.